Hey, friends. I figured I'd tell some Willie Nelson stories for you guys today. I'm going to focus on his early years when he first got to Nashville and was trying to get himself established as a songwriter. And those are famously rough years for him. But I've been rereading this book here lately. It's got me on this kick. It's Willie's autobiography. It's called It's a Long Story, My Life by Willie Nelson with David Ritz. It's really good. If you're a Willie fan, I think you'll enjoy it, and I strongly recommend it. One thing that keeps jumping into my mind as I read about these early years, there's all these moments when Willie Nelson would just hit a brick wall. He'd be trying to support his family with his songwriting and his music, and would just hit a brick wall and would end up in a desperate situation, and we're a situation where a lot of people, if they didn't have the good fortune that Willie had, would just end up getting a job driving a truck and say the hell with music altogether. But there's all of these different instances of someone stepping in and helping Willie, someone going way out of their way because they see something in him. And there's just instances over and over again. And I'd like to point out a few of those instances. It's nice to be reminded that there are good people out there who help people that we care about. One instance was before he got to Nashville. He bounced around Texas, and I won't go into all of that, but he ended up in Houston, and he thought that he could go ahead and make some a living playing music. But his wife and his kids, they're about broke, and he shows up to the Esquire Ballroom in Houston. Now, I believe his wife and kids were waiting for him out in the car. He walks inside. This is during the day, and there's a band rehearsing, and the band is led by a man named Larry Butler, who is quite a big deal in Houston at the time, and he has a radio show and is well known. And Willie walks up to him and introduces himself. And I said, "Well, what do you need, Willie?" And he said, "Well, I'm looking for a job." He says, "Well, what do you do?" He says, "I'm a singer and I'm a picker." He says, "Man, we don't need a singer and a picker. We're all covered." And Willie starts feeling desperate because he has to raise some money to feed his family. And he says, "Well, I also write songs, and I got some good ones, I think." And he says, "Well, why don't you play those for me and let me hear them?" So Willie Nelson sits down, plays Crazy, The Nightlife, Turn Out the Lights, The Party's Over, plays these great all-time classic songs that Larry Butler's probably one of the first people to ever hear him. And Larry says, "Man, those are great, Willie. Those are really great." He says, "Well, I'll tell you what," Willie says, "I will sell each of these songs to you for $10 a piece." And Larry Butler says, "Let me get this right. I give you $10 for one of these songs. I can put my name on it as the composer, tell everyone I wrote it, and I own all the rights, and all I have to do is give you $10. And Willie said, "Yes, you'd be doing me a favor." And Larry Butler says, "You can't do that. And that's just, I'd be ripping you off." And he says, "No, you'd be doing me a favor." Willie was that desperate. And Larry Butler at one point says, "Well, these songs could be worth thousands of dollars," which is funny when you think of what a huge hit Crazy ended up being. Thousands of dollars would be, a small pittance. Larry Butler said, "I'll tell you what, Willie, what I will do, I will loan you $50 and you show up here and you play guitar in my band until you've worked that off. And but you have to promise me you won't, go trying to sell these songs to somebody else. You'll keep a hold of them." And Willie says, "All right, I do it." So he felt great about that, and that got him a little bit of traction in Houston and just got the time over. But he decided somewhere down the road, I have to move to Nashville. That's where the songwriters are, and that's where I need to make my stand. And he had a really good way of looking at Nashville. I'm going to read a little bit for you right here to give you an idea. I like the way Willie thought about Nashville. He referred to it as the store. He says, "Nashville liked to bill itself as Music City. I just saw it as the store. The store is where you shop. If you're a music producer, you shop for songs at the store. I needed to get to the store to stock my merchandise. I thought my merchandise was good, so that should have been a simple task. It wasn't. Nashville was a struggle. There were good moments, but it was an uphill battle. I did get my merchandise in the store, but that wasn't enough to get me over. With all the music coming out of Nashville, all the great musicians and legendary producers, you'd think I'd be a natural fit. I never was. For that, I don't blame Nashville. I blame my own peculiar nature. When Willie decided to move to Nashville, he dropped his wife and kids off at the in laws in Waco and drove to Nashville in a 1950 Buick. And when he pulled up on Music Row, he just got into town, the Buick broke down. He had just enough money to stay at a terrible hotel overnight, and then he was broke. The next morning, he went to get coffee at a coffee shop, and he run into his old buddy Billy Walker, who he'd known from Texas. And Billy Walker had had a little bit of fortune. He was working for the Grand Ole Opry, and he would explain to Willie how playing on the Grand Ole Opry doesn't pay very well at all, but it gets you to know everyone in Nashville. And he's like, "Well, how are you doing, Willie?" And he's like, "Well, I just got into town. I don't know anybody, and I'm broke." And Billy Walker said, "I'll tell you what, you can stay with me and my wife." And he put Willie up for 3 months. Just think about it. People don't do that. They let him stay with him for 3 months, took him around town, introduced him to everyone. And, most of the people, most of the producers and such weren't interested in Willie's songs, but he got a little bit of a foothold in those 3 months. He got him a job selling encyclopedias door to door and was trying to pitch songs whenever he could. After the 3 months were up, Willie Nelson's wife and kids came to Nashville, and they got a place at a trailer park. It was a rundown, nasty trailer park sitting in between a junkyard and a cemetery. And it's a place where a lot of songwriters lived when they first moved to Nashville. It's made famous. It's the one that Roger Miller lived in. And when he's singing about trailers for sailor rent, rooms to let 50 cents, and King of the Road, that's the trailer park he's singing about. And Willie was living there, feeling kind of bad that his family was, living in this dingy, rundown place. He wasn't making money. His wife ended up getting 2 jobs, bartending and waiting tables, and she was paying all the bills, and he was feeling guilty about that. Being a man in 1960, that was looked down upon. He's pretty honest about behaving poorly and cheating on his wife while she's supporting him and the kids while he's trying to do this songwriting thing. I appreciate the honesty, but it's not easy to read things like that. And he talks about his own hypocrisy of if she did the same thing, how he couldn't live with it, but he thought it was all right for him to be that way. But he would be hanging out at Tootsies at night. It's where all these songwriters would hang out, and where people like Hank Cochran, Harlan Howard, Roger Miller, later on, Tom T. Hall, Chris Christopherson. Tootsie's became this stronghold, is where people would show up. Tootsie was a woman who would be a mother to a lot of these songwriters, and if you didn't have money to pay for a beer, or food or whatever, she would go ahead and front you, and then you would pay back later. And it was just the main hangout. So Willie talked about being there at Tootsie's and drinking, and somebody would pull out a guitar and all the songwriters would play the different songs that they had been working on. And there was a steel player named Buddy Emmons who would join in and just hang out, and he would play steel along with whatever people were playing. So it would make your song sound a lot better. A little side note about Buddy Emmons. This is Buddy Emmons' tape recorder that I bought from his estate sale. So when you see this show up in some of the videos that I made with the interviews, that's Buddy Emmons. And the videos that I've made of me sitting on the front porch, I'm sitting on Buddy Emmons' rocking chair that I bought from his estate sale. That was Buddy's with, it's one of the great steel players of all time. So a little side note there for you. But when Willie was about to bottom out pretty much in Nashville and nothing was going right, was at Tootsie's one night and it was just snowing. And I'd like to read you a little section here about Willie bottoming out. And when a cold front hit Nashville that winter, I sat at the bar at Tootsies and gazed out the window, watching the drifting snow, feeling as low can be. My soul was frozen over. The warm sunshine of hope was a million miles away. I didn't know how long I could go on in Nashville. I still hadn't found a way to get my songs in the store. And even though I had found good pals like Roger and Hank, DJs Grant Turner and Ralph Emery, I felt like I was sliding down a slippery slope. You can bet been downing big quantities of whiskey and wine and beer. I was no longer in my right mind. I was in my who gives a fuck mind. I was out of my mind. I got up from the bar stool and walked out into the cold. I didn't have a heavy coat, just a denim jacket, but the freezing temperature didn't bother me. The chilling wind didn't bother me. The snowfall didn't bother me. Nothing bothered me. The city was still, hardly any traffic, no one on the street except me. A weird peace came over me as I walked off the sidewalk into the middle of the street, where, don't ask me why, I decided to lie down and rest. Right then and there, I lay on my back, eyes wide open, watching the snowflakes fall on my head. I considered the possibility that a car might well roll over me. I guess I must have been okay with the possibility because for at least 10 minutes, I didn't move. Maybe I was looking for an out, or maybe I was just taking a break or a chance. It's tough to know exactly what I was up to. I was drunk, and as a rule, drunks do crazy shit. I can't tell you that I was trying to commit suicide because I wasn't. In those days, I usually packed a pistol. In my young and stupid macho mind, I thought that's what real men did. If I were really interested in ending it all, I could have shot myself in the head, but that thought did not cross my mind. Instead, it was just a matter of reclining in the middle of the street on a snowy night in Nashville. That's an interesting moment of Willie bottoming out. And it goes on to talk about how the great songwriters that he would hang out with there at Tootsies, they would have these song pools of Mel Tillis, Roger Miller, Harlan Howard, Hank Cochran. One night at Tootsies when Willie's playing songs, Hank Cochran heard some of his songs and he's like, Willie, you are good. These are really great songs. And Willie says, well, I don't think Nashville thinks they're very good. He says, well, you need to stop, worrying about Nashville. You need to go to Goodlettsville, which is a really funny thing to hear nowadays because Goodlettsville is a northern suburb of Nashville, a town just north. And he's like, why Goodlettsville? And Hank Cochran says, well, there's a publishing company there, Pamper Music, owned by Hal Smith and Ray Price, and they will appreciate what you're doing. Hank Cochran was a pretty infamous song plugger besides being a songwriter. He would go to extremes to get his songs in front of people. When you hear some of the stories about him showing up at people's houses, or just meeting them at the laundromat and playing, singing songs for them, it sounds annoying as hell now, but it worked for him at the time. And so Willie goes out to Pamper Music, meets Hal Smith and sings some songs for him. And Hal Smith is like, yeah, those are pretty good. And didn't seem like it went over that well. And when he was done, Hank Cochran took him back to the trailer park and dropped him off. And he says, I'll tell you how, what the word is in the next day or two. We'll hear something, Willie. So Hank Cochran shows up the next day and tells Willie, you have a publishing deal. They want to be your publisher. You're hired on. You'll be making $50 a week writing songs. And that's all you have to do, Willie. Write songs. You get $50 a week advance off of whatever you get later on. Willie thought that was great. So all he had to do was go into an office every day and write songs. He later found out, this took quite a while to find this out, but Hank Cochran had talked to Hal Smith about getting Willie on as a staff writer, and Hal Smith was not interested. He's like, man, we have plenty of writers. We don't need this guy. And Hank Cochran said, well, you were going to give me a $50 a week raise. What you should do is give that money to Willie Nelson, and I will stay at the same salary, but just take him on because I think he's going to make some money for this company one day. Willie didn't even know that. But thanks to Hank Cochran's generosity, that's how he got his publishing deal. And Hank Cochran was smart enough to know it wasn't all altruistic. He thought that Willie was going to write some big hits, and he figured he could co-write those hits with Willie and make a lot of money. If Willie was still in town and had a steady income writing. So Willie and Hank Cochran were writing songs together in this office, and they weren't really coming up with too much. And one day Hank Cochran had to go somewhere, and he's like, "I'll tell you what, Willie, while I'm gone, you write a song and you'll play it for me when I get back." And he's like, "What'll I write about?" He's like, "You're a songwriter. Come up with something." So he leaves Willie. Willie is sitting in this room by himself and can't think of anything. And he's like, "I got to write a song." I told him I'd write a song. So he's looking around, kind of, "What do I write about?" And he says, "Hello, Walls. How'd things go for you today?" And he thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So he starts writing some more and he ends up writing Hello, Walls. When Hank Cochran got back, Willie played it for him and he's like, "Willie, that is a hit. You did a good job. That is a hit. You're going to make some money off of that song." When Farron Young heard Hello Walls, he knew it was a hit. He wanted to cut it. He said, "Willie, we're going to make some money with this." And he'd heard that Willie was hurting for money pretty bad. So Farron Young gave him $500 advance. And he said, "Man, there's $500. We'll settle up down the road." When Willie got his first royalty check, it was for $3,000. This is just a few weeks later. He goes over to see Farron Young and says, "I'm going to repay you that $500. And Farron Young's like, "Man, don't worry about it. I hear you have some cows over there where you live. You have a new calf. Why don't you just give me one of those calves down the road?" And I was like, "Well, all right." So time goes by. And whenever they would run into each other, it became this joke about, "Why don't you how's that calf doing?" And Willie said, "Oh, it's getting good and fat." But recording this Hello Walls and having a big hit just opened up a lot of doors, as you would imagine. And Willie started getting a lot of other cuts, and it was the first time he'd never really had to worry about money that much. Somewhere down the road, Willie said that he was playing a rodeo in Austin, Texas, and they were auctioning off this prized bull, this huge prize bull. Willie bought it for $15,000 and he had it sent to Farron Young in Nashville. As Farron Young walks out into his driveway, and there's this huge prize bull sitting there, and there's a letter saying, "Farron, your calf grew up." And so Farron Young ended up putting that bull out to stud, and it, had a nice retirement for breeding purposes throughout the rest of his life. I've gone on for quite a while here. There's a lot to tell about Willie, and I'll probably tell some more. But if you take away one thing from this video, just think of all the acts of kindness that brought us Willie Nelson. All of these moments when Willie, could have just went off and drove a truck and you'd never hear from him again. Being good enough, is just a small part of it. It takes a lot of luck, and Willie had a lot of luck and a lot of people who went the extra mile because they believed in him. And I like hearing stories like that. If you have a favorite Willie story from those, early years, or a favorite Willie song, let me know in the comments. I'd like to hear about it. I think Nightlife is about as good as it gets when you hear Ray Price doing it. It's just timeless and perfect in every way, I think. But subscribe, hit the like button, and I will see you guys down the road. Much love to you.